Welcome back to Animal Encounters. I've got something different for you today. 6 cases where the evidence points at a shark far larger than anything science currently accepts, beginning with a sonar record the Navy has never explained. It was the morning of March 14th, 2019, about 400 miles east of Guam, where the seafloor drops away into some of the deepest water on the planet. A naval survey vessel was running a scheduled acoustic mapping exercise over a trench section measured at more than 26,000 feet. The exercise was routine, the equipment was standard, and the crew had run the same pattern over the same trench section more than once. Nothing about that day was supposed to produce anything worth writing down, and for the first several hours, it did not. At 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, the array returned a contact at a depth of roughly 4,100 feet. The return was biological. That part was never in question, and nobody involved has ever suggested otherwise. What could not be settled was the size of it. Sonar is not a tape measure, and everybody who works with it says so before they say anything else. A biological return carries a margin of error wide enough that no responsible operator will put a hard figure on a single contact. Soft tissue reflects poorly, and gas spaces reflect strongly, and two animals of identical size can produce very different returns depending on how they are oriented when the pulse reaches them. But the same shape came back on 3 consecutive passes over 40 minutes at the same depth, holding the same heading, and across those 3 passes the estimates clustered rather than scattered. That is the detail that changed the mood on that vessel. A bad return does not usually agree with itself 3 times. The contact was also moving in a way that ruled out the obvious answer. A whale at depth is a diving animal. It descends, it works, it returns to the surface to breathe, and on a sonar plot that behavior is unmistakable. This contact did not ascend at all across the entire period. It was tracked. It held 4,000 feet and it traveled laterally, slowly, and steadily in a straight line for the better part of an hour. Sonar cannot tell you what something is. What struck me is that it agreed with itself 3 separate times, and that is not what bad data normally does. The decision to put a vehicle in the water was made quickly, and nobody aboard was hunting a monster. This was a survey crew with an unexplained contact on their plot and equipment on deck that could go and look, and looking is what that equipment is for. An unmanned vehicle was launched toward the last confirmed position and reached working depth about 50 minutes later. By then, the contact had moved on, and the drone recorded 19 minutes of largely empty water before it began its ascent. The footage from that dive shows almost nothing. Almost. At 16 minutes and 40 seconds, the drone's forward light catches a moving edge at the outer limit of its range, and the shape stays in frame for a little over 3 seconds before it is gone. It is dark. It is partial, and the team who reviewed it were careful to say it establishes nothing on its own. What it appears to show is a caudal fin passing across the light. Using the drone's own known dimensions as a rough scale reference, the team estimated that the visible fin may have been wider than the vehicle, which measured just under 4 feet across. That estimate came with all the warnings it should have. The animal was not on the same plane as the camera. The light was poor. The range was uncertain. Nobody claimed they had measured a shark from 3 seconds of footage. What they said was that the shape in the light looked bigger than they expected it to be. The drone came back up with damage that nobody noticed until it was on deck and being rinsed down. 2 of the exterior housing panels showed impact scoring, not a bite, and nobody has ever described it as one. More of a graze, the kind of mark left when something large passes close and catches an edge on the way by the way a boat hull picks up a line of paint from a dock it never really hit. The impression pressed into one panel measured about 28 inches at its widest. That figure is the reason this case is still discussed. The investigators did not treat it as a jaw measurement, because a curved scrape on an ROV housing cannot tell you exactly how wide the mouth of the animal was. The angle of contact matters. The shape of the vehicle matters. Movement matters. A mark like that can be made larger or smaller than the part of the animal that made it. But the people who inspected the housing agreed on the more limited point. The damage was far larger than they would expect from an ordinary shark interaction with a vehicle of that size. It did not prove a length, it did not prove a species, It did not put a number on anything living in that trench. It was simply a mark too large to make anyone comfortable. Recovered from the scoring were tissue traces and a small quantity of hard fragment material the recovery crew described as consistent with shark denticles, an assessment noted at the time and never formally confirmed. The material went out for sequencing. The result was not a clean answer. The sequence was degraded and only partially readable. What could be recovered appeared broadly consistent with shark tissue, but there was not enough usable material to identify a species with confidence. The laboratory logged the result as inconclusive rather than unidentified, and the distinction between those two words is doing a great deal of work. Inconclusive does not mean they found something unknown. It just means they found something they could not resolve. After that, the trail cools in a way that will become familiar over the next 20 minutes, because it happens in almost every case in this video. A records request filed 3 years later came back with the exercise acknowledged and the contact log withheld under an exemption cited by number and not explained. The drone footage does not appear in any accessible archive. A partial acoustic readout believed to be from that survey circulated briefly in 2022 and was withdrawn within weeks at the request of a party who has never been named. The person who put it out has not published under their own names since. None of that proves anything. It is worth being straight about that. But the reason this case leads today is simple enough. The recording exists, the damage to that housing exists, and the 28-inch impression was measured by people with no particular interest in the answer being strange. The Pacific keeps most of what it knows. The next case came ashore in front of witnesses on a beach in South America, and there was nothing subtle about it. It was the morning of the 2nd of August, 2016, on a stretch of coast in the north of Chile, where the cold current runs close in, and the water goes deep within a mile of the sand. A humpback whale came ashore overnight on an open beach, a young adult measuring a little over 38 feet, and by first light, there were perhaps 40 people standing around it. Whales strand. It is common, it is sad, and in most cases, the cause is illness or disorientation, and the animal is dying before it ever reaches the sand. What made this one different was visible from 200 yards away, which is why so many people photographed it before anybody official arrived. There was a single large wound on the left flank, forward of the dorsal, and it had taken a section clean out of the animal. Not a scrape, and not the usual pattern of overlapping scavenger bites. Whale carcasses are fed on constantly once they die, and that damage is obvious and messy, dozens of small bites from many mouths over hours. This was different. The margin was unusually clean. The tissue around it appeared crushed and torn rather than sliced. To the one person on the beach with any relevant training, it looked consistent with a large bite. But photographs can only take you so far. Nobody could say from images alone that it was one wound made by one mouth. Nobody could say with certainty that the whale was alive when the injury happened. Without a formal examination of the carcass, the exact mechanism was always going to remain uncertain. A stranded whale is a sad thing, and not a strange one. A wound that appears consistent with a very large bite is a different story entirely. Photographs taken that morning by at least 9 separate people were later used to estimate the wound geometry, with the whale's own length as the scale reference. The arc across the widest part of the injury was put at between 24 and 28 inches. That number needs to be treated carefully. A wound is not a mold of the mouth that made it. Tissue tears. It stretches. It changes after death. Perspective changes what a photograph can tell you. Nobody can look at an image like that and responsibly calculate the exact size of a predator. But the injury was big enough to raise the question. The other predator that takes pieces out of humpbacks in that ocean is the orca, which is well documented and was the first thing raised. Orca predation can leave rake marks from teeth dragging across tissue, and those were not obvious in the photographs. That did not rule out an orca. It only meant the wound did not look like the usual examples people had on file. The obvious alternative was raised immediately and taken seriously, which is that a boat strike or a large propeller can produce a substantial clean-edged wound and does so to whales somewhere in the world every week of the year. 2 things sat against it. Propeller damage is characteristically a series of parallel cuts rather than a single removal, and there were no parallel marks anywhere else on that animal. and the margin of the wound appeared to show crushing and tearing rather than the shearing pattern of a blade, which was noted by the one person present that morning with any relevant training. But appeared is the important word. The carcass was removed within about 30 hours by heavy equipment and taken inland for disposal. That is standard practice for a stranded whale on a public beach and was nobody's attempt to hide anything. It is also the reason there is no physical evidence. No tissue was retained from the wound margin, because retaining tissue was not anybody's job that day. No formal examination was ever carried out. Everything that survives from that beach is photographic. 9 people photographed it before anybody official arrived. That is the only reason there is anything left to look at. A marine biology student who had been on the beach compiled the photographs into a short paper 2 years later and submitted it to a regional journal, arguing only that the wound appeared inconsistent with ordinary scavenging and that a sample should have been taken. The submission was returned without review. The reason given was that photographic evidence without physical sampling could not support the conclusion, which is a fair position to take and also the end of the road. The animal that made the wound has never been identified, and the honest position is that it never can be now, because everything that might have answered the question went into a hole in the ground outside a Chilean town in August of 2016. A whale carcass at least gives you something to measure. In the Tasman, 3 years earlier, an entire tag shark disappeared and left behind a single piece of equipment that told a story nobody wanted to read out loud. It was the afternoon of the 9th of April, 2013, off the coast of New South Wales in Australia. A research program had tagged a female great white measured at 9 feet in length, fitted her with a data logging tag, and released her to track her movements down the coast. The tag records depth and temperature continuously and detaches on a preset schedule, floats to the surface, and transmits. The tag came back 4 months later, washed up on a beach about 2.5 miles from where the animal had been released, found by somebody walking a dog who had no idea what they had picked up. The data on it covered the full period, minute by minute, exactly as designed. What it covered in the final stretch of that period is why anybody outside the program has ever heard of this case. The shark's record is ordinary for most of it, coastal movement in the range you would expect. Then, over a very short window, the depth trace drops from around 600 feet to just over 2,300 feet. That is a descent of more than a quarter mile, and it happens faster than that animal had descended at any point in the preceding 4 months of continuous recording. At nearly the same moment, the temperature reading on the tag rises sharply. The tag goes from recording cold water to a sustained reading in the high 60s Fahrenheit, and it holds there. A tag does not warm that quickly, while the surrounding water is getting colder. The most straightforward explanation was that the tag had entered the body of another animal. That is not the only explanation anyone could imagine. Tags fail. Sensors can be affected by conditions the researchers did not anticipate. But when the temperature remains elevated and the tag begins moving through the water column in a pattern that belongs to a swimming animal rather than a drifting object, the internal explanation becomes difficult to avoid. For days afterward, the tag went deep in the day and shallow at night. Then it was expelled, floated to the surface, and came ashore. The 9-foot great white it had been fitted to was never detected again by any receiver anywhere on that coast in the 4 months that followed or in the years since. The program was careful in public and has stayed careful since, and deserves credit for that rather than suspicion. Their stated position was that the tag had been consumed by a larger predator, that the likeliest candidate was a larger great white, and that cannibalism among the species is documented and not especially rare. That is a reasonable, conservative, defensible reading, and it may well be the right one. The difficulty is not that a larger shark could have eaten a 9-foot animal. Larger sharks eat smaller sharks. That is not extraordinary. The difficulty is that the tag tells you something larger was there, but it cannot tell you how much larger. It cannot tell you what species it was. It cannot tell you whether the animal that swallowed the tag was an exceptional great white or something else entirely. They said a bigger shark ate it, and they are probably right. In Japan, a research submersible went looking on purpose, and what came back is still sitting on a hard drive in a university that will not discuss it. It was the morning of the 26th of October, 2021, in Suruga Bay, on the Pacific coast of Honshu, the deepest bay in Japan, where the bottom falls to more than 8,000 feet within sight of land. A crewed submersible was working a survey line at around 3,400 feet, part of a long-running project on deep-water fish communities that had been running dives in that bay for 11 years. 40 minutes into the dive, the pilot brought the vehicle to a hover to let a school of deep-water fish clear the light, which is ordinary practice and happens on most dives. What came through, the light behind them, stayed in view for close to a minute and a half, which at that depth, at that range, is an extraordinarily long look at anything. The 3 people aboard were debriefed separately that evening and described the same thing independently, which matters because this is the sort of encounter where people talk themselves into agreement afterward. A shark. Unmistakably a shark by body plan and by the motion of the tail, passing at a distance the pilot put at 40 to 50 feet, the outer edge of usable light at that depth. It did not react to the vehicle. It did not change course. It passed through and continued along the slope. The submersible's external camera recorded the whole pass. The vehicle's own length, a little over 23 feet, was the scale reference in the footage. The team's dive log estimated the animal somewhere in the 30 to 35 foot range, with a note that the shark was not on the same plane as the camera and that the figure could be significantly wrong in either direction. That note matters more than the estimate. They did not write down a confirmed 35-foot animal. They wrote down what it looked like from the only scale reference they had and immediately wrote down that they might be wrong. Honestly, that is why I take it seriously. If the upper end of that estimate was anywhere close to accurate, only 2 living sharks are known to approach that kind of size, and both of them are filter feeders. The whale shark gets to around 40 feet, and the basking shark is not far behind it, and both were raised on the first day. It is worth saying that both do occur in Japanese waters, and whale sharks have been recorded diving far deeper than that submersible was working. Neither was ruled out on range. They were questioned on the animal itself. A whale shark has a wide, flat terminal mouth, a checkered pattern, and a body built like a barrel. A basking shark has a small head, an enormous gaping mouth, and gill slits that run almost the whole way around it. The animal in that footage had a conical head, a mouth set on the underside of the snout, and the heavy forward mass of a predator. The footage was shown quietly to 4 specialists over the following months. Individually, none of them told what the others had said. All 4 agreed it was a shark. All 4 agreed it was not a whale shark. Not one of them would put a species to it. 2 suggested it might be a known species appearing at an unprecedented size. 1 suggested the scale reference had been misread. The 4th declined to offer an interpretation at all. An application for funding to return to the same slope with better lighting and a longer bottom time was submitted twice and declined twice, the second time without a stated reason. The project's dives in that bay ended the following year for reasons the university has described as budgetary. The footage has not been published, has not been formally withdrawn, and remains, according to the last person who asked, under internal review. 4 specialists looked at it. All 4 agreed on what it was not, and not one of them would say what it was. 2 of the 3 people who were in that submersible have never spoken publicly about the dive. The 3rd has, once, briefly, and said only that they saw a large shark and that they do not know what it was, which is either the most disciplined statement in this entire video or the most frustrating one. Japan kept its footage and said nothing. South Africa had something none of the others did, which was a piece of the animal itself. It was the afternoon of the 19th of June, 2015, off the coast near Gansby in South Africa, which is about as heavily studied a piece of shark water as exists anywhere. A cage diving operator working a site he had run for 9 years brought up a cage with damage to the upper frame and a fragment of tooth wedged in the weld line. The damage itself was not extraordinary and was not treated as such by anybody on that boat. Sharks make contact with cages. It is documented. It is filmed constantly, and every operator working that coast has repaired a frame at some point. It is part of the cost of the business. Nobody on that boat thought they had anything unusual until the fragment came out of the weld. It was a section of the crown, broken, not a complete tooth, measuring about 2.5 inches along the preserved edge with the serration pattern intact. The serrations are the part that mattered. Serration, spacing, and shape are diagnostic in shark teeth. They are how fragments are identified when nothing else survives, and the pattern on this fragment was measured, photographed, and described by 3 people before the fragment left that harbor. The fragment was fresh, and everybody who handled it said so immediately. There was no mineralization, no staining, and no adhering sediment, and it came out of the weld line of a cage that had been sitting on a trailer the previous evening. Whatever this was, it was not something dredged off the bottom or picked up from a fossil bed, and that single fact is what separates this case from the enormous number of Megalodon tooth stories that turn out to be exactly what they sound like. A fossil tooth in a net proves nothing. A fresh broken crown wedged into a cage that was in the water that morning is a different object entirely. The fragment was too incomplete to reconstruct a full tooth with the kind of precision people like to see in stories like this. There was no root. There was no complete crown. There was no way to put a trustworthy number on its original height. But the surviving curvature and the spacing of the serrations suggested a complete tooth substantially larger than the largest great white teeth the analysts had on file. That does not identify an animal. It does make the fragment hard to dismiss. The fragment was submitted for analysis the same week. It was confirmed as shark, confirmed as recent rather than fossil, and the report noted that the size and serration pattern were not consistent with any species known from those waters. The report also noted that a single broken crown, without the root and without the complete tooth, cannot support a species identification, which is correct. Where it went afterward is difficult to establish, and is the part that gets repeated most often. The fragment was sent on to a second facility for a proper structural analysis of the serration pattern. It was logged as received. It has not been seen since by anybody who has been willing to talk about it. And repeated requests over the following 4 years produced a series of responses about ongoing work, and then, eventually, no responses at all. It was logged as received and then it stopped existing. That has happened in half the cases in this video. The photographs and the measurements taken at the harbor still exist and are the only remaining record of the object. The operator has spoken about it exactly twice, both times reluctantly, and has said on both occasions that he has no theory and does not want one, and that he replaced the frame the following week and has been working that same site ever since. The last one has the least, because it was recorded by an instrument that was already listening for something else and had no interest in sharks whatsoever. It was the night of the 5th of November, 2018, on a hydroacoustic monitoring array in the South Atlantic, part of an international network of underwater listening stations built to detect nuclear testing. The stations run continuously, they record everything they hear, and they are calibrated to standards no marine biology project could afford. At 23 minutes past midnight, one station logged a biological signal at a range of roughly 80 miles. Biological signals are logged constantly by these arrays, and it is not remotely unusual. The vast majority are whales, which are loud, distinctive, extremely well characterized, and represented in reference libraries built over decades. This one was flagged for review because it did not match anything in the library. The signal had the acoustic signature of a large body moving through water rather than a vocalization, which is a different kind of detection and a rarer one. Animals that call announce themselves. Animals that only swim are detected by the disturbance they leave, and it takes something substantial to leave a disturbance, an array notices at range. It was tracked for a little over 2 hours. The acoustic model produced an unusually large target estimate, large enough that the technician who reviewed it initially recorded it as a possible equipment fault. That does not mean the array measured the length of an animal. These systems are built to detect extremely faint sound over enormous distances. They are sensitive. They are sophisticated. But sensitivity does not mean they can determine the physical dimensions of an unidentified biological target with perfect accuracy. A strong acoustic disturbance can be affected by the body itself, by its movement, by its orientation, and by the conditions carrying sound through the water. The estimate was rerun with a second model and returned a comparable anomaly. A second analyst reviewed it and reached the same cautious conclusion. The acoustic model had produced an unusually large target estimate, but they could not determine whether that reflected the animal itself, the way it was moving, or an artifact of propagation conditions. What they could say was that the movement profile did not match the whale tracks they had used for comparison. Whales are the default explanation for almost everything these arrays hear, and there are excellent reasons for that. But a whale is a breathing animal, and its acoustic track usually shows regular changes in depth because it has no choice. This track showed no ascent at all across 2 hours. It stayed between 2,000 and 3,000 feet the entire time. The detection was written up in an internal technical note as an unclassified biological anomaly, a category that exists because these arrays occasionally hear things nobody has cataloged. That note was referenced in a footnote in an unrelated paper on array calibration in 2020, which is the only reason anybody outside the network knows the detection exists at all. Requests for the recording have gone through the appropriate channels several times. The response, which is consistent and probably honest, is that raw acoustic data from the network is not released because the network exists for treaty verification and its data is handled accordingly. There is no conspiracy in that. It is how those stations work. Everybody agrees that recording exists. Nobody outside that network has ever been allowed to listen to it. So the most frustrating piece of evidence in this video sits on a server belonging to an organization that has no interest in sharks, was captured by an instrument designed for something else entirely, and will almost certainly never be released. Whatever crossed that array at 80 miles on a November night produced a biological disturbance the analysts could not classify. It stayed at depth for 2 hours. It did not fit the whale comparisons they had available. And it has never been detected again.